Has anyone ever attempted to deceive you with a scheme? Something so bold, so utterly daring that for a brief moment you almost feel compelled to acknowledge their sheer, unmitigated nerve. Yes, that sensation endures about as long as a snowflake on a scorching stovetop. Then, reality intervenes and you recall that it's your land, your assets, and they are on the verge of learning that tangling with a retired civil engineer who specialized in land surveying and water rights, a man who currently possesses an excessive amount of free time, is a profoundly unwise decision. Share in the comments where you are joining from, because the story of our distinguished Homeowners Association president, a woman we'll refer to as Brenda McKendittled for reasons that will become glaringly apparent, is truly remarkable. She genuinely subscribed to the notion, in whatever alternative reality she inhabited, that she could unilaterally opt to install a water pipeline directly through the center of my ranch, connect to my private spring, the very origin of it, mind you, and supply complimentary water to her immaculately kept little domain of suburban residents. The crowning touch? When I quite justifiably shut off the unauthorized tap on my own property, she had the audacity to summon the sheriff on me. Spoiler warning, everyone, that specific emergency call did not unfold quite as Brenda had envisioned. Not by a considerable margin. My retirement vision was straightforward: tranquility, silence, and the uninterrupted pleasure of the several hundred acres of undulating Texas hill country I had dedicated my entire life to acquiring. My ranch, Serenity Springs, was not merely a catchy name, it was the location of a natural artesian spring documented on deeds extending back to the 1800s. It served as the vital essence of my property, supplying a couple of stock ponds and furnishing all the water I required. The rear 40 acres of my land bordered a more recent, rather affluent housing development, Whispering Pines Estates, managed by an HOA known for its zealousness. I largely preferred my own company, finding contentment in the sound of rustling leaves and the distant lowing of my neighbor's cattle. My days were occupied with tinkering in my workshop, reading, and sporadically inspecting my property lines, a practice instilled by decades of surveying. I am familiar with every marker, every fence post, every subtle detail of my land as well as I know my own hand. The initial sign that something was amiss arrived subtly. A faint, unfamiliar thrum of machinery carried on the breeze when the wind blew just so, a sound that didn't quite harmonize with the usual rural orchestra. Then I observed the water level in my primary stock pond, the one directly replenished by the spring's overflow. It appeared slightly lower than it ought to be for that time of year, even considering a period of dry weather. I am fastidious about such matters, I maintain records. It was a minuscule difference, easily disregarded, yet it planted a small seed of disquiet in my thoughts. Thus, on a brisk autumn morning, I resolved to take a stroll along the southern perimeter, the one contiguous with Whispering Pines. It did not take long for my unease to escalate into outright disbelief. Approximately 50 yards inside my distinctly marked fence line, a raw, red wound had been carved through the earth, a newly dug trench, and situated within it, a brand new 6-inch PVC pipe. My jaw, I surmise, was somewhere near my boot tops. I traced the trench. It extended directly from the sheltered alcove where my spring issues from the limestone, proceeded arrow straight across a good quarter-mile of my pasture, and vanished beneath the fence towards the HOA development. My first reaction wasn't fury, not immediately. It was a profound, almost disorienting sense of perplexity. This was not a trivial encroachment, a slightly misplaced fence post. This was a substantial, intentional infrastructure undertaking executed with an astounding degree of trespass. I returned to my office, a room filled with filing cabinets holding every deed, survey plat, and legal instrument related to Serenity Springs. I retrieved the master survey, the very one I had personally confirmed when I acquired the land. Unsurprisingly, there was no easement, no right-of-way, no indication of any shared water accord with the Whispering Pines development. The spring and the land upon which it was situated were unequivocally entirely mine. I even possessed the original water rights filings from the state, affirming its status as a private source. Someone, it seemed, had committed a monumental blunder, or, as a more skeptical notion started to materialize, someone had made a monumental presumption. Concluding that a direct, civil approach constituted the optimal initial measure, I tidied myself up and drove to the Whispering Pines Community Clubhouse, which also functioned as the HOA's operational hub. The establishment reeked of fresh paint and the pseudo-affluent aroma of engineered wood flooring and excessively large, faux Tuscan furnishings. I inquired about the HOA president and was guided to a woman presiding by a coffee station, Brenda McKendittled. She was likely in her late 50s, impeccably dressed in what appeared to be designer yoga attire, despite it being midday on a Tuesday. Her blonde hair was styled into a helmet of unyielding perfection. A substantial, chunky gold necklace that proclaimed, "Notice me," graced her neck, and her countenance bore an expression of perpetual, mildly pained condescension as though the world persistently failed to satisfy her stringent criteria. When I introduced myself and elucidated, calmly and courteously, that there seemed to be a new pipeline installed on my property, originating from my spring, she barely broke stride in pouring her herbal tea. "Oh, that," she uttered, gesticulating dismissively with a hand bedecked with several large rings. "We're merely undertaking a small bit of, you understand, drainage enhancement for the community. Organizing things. It benefits all, my dear." She smiled, a constrained, artificial little upturn of the lips. "Nothing for you to fret your little head about." The sheer effrontery of it, the nonchalant dismissal, the patent falsehood. That was the moment bewilderment started to transmute into a slowly igniting fuse of indignation. I was dear, and my little head shouldn't worry. This woman, who evidently wouldn't know a riparian right from a right of spring, was attempting to deceive me about a major unauthorized excavation and water diversion on my land. I reiterated, still composedly, that it was unambiguously my property and my water source and that no such undertaking had been sanctioned. Her smile wavered, supplanted by a brief flash of irritation. "Well, I'm certain it's all perfectly acceptable," she retorted, her voice taking on a steely quality. "The community requires dependable water, and we are making sure that our engineers have addressed everything." Her engineers on my land without my awareness or consent. The fuse shortened substantially. I informed her that I anticipated the work would halt immediately and the pipeline would be dismantled. She actually let out a scoff. "That's quite out of the question. It's a community initiative. Now, if you'll pardon me, I have significant HOA affairs to deal with." And with that, she turned her back on me, a distinct indication that, in her view, the discussion was concluded. "Oh, Brenda," I mused, "you are completely clueless. You have just initiated hostilities with a man whose entire professional life was founded on comprehending lines on a map and the statutes that regulate them." This was not going to be a minor concern. This was going to be her predicament, a very, very substantial one. The journey back to my ranch was pervaded by a cold, systematic anger. Brenda McKentitle's dismissive demeanor, her flagrant contempt for property rights, her supposition that she could merely seize what she desired, it was astounding. But anger devoid of action is merely clamor. My professional acumen, latent during the initial phase of retirement, surged back to vitality. Phase 1, the civil inquiry, had failed dismally. Phase 2, scrupulous documentation and legal reinforcement, was now in progress. The first action I took was to retrieve my high-resolution drone from its container. Over the subsequent few days, I performed a sequence of aerial surveys, photographing and video recording the entire span of the offending pipeline, from its point of origin at my springhead to where it disappeared beneath the fence into Whispering Pines. I recorded GPS coordinates at numerous junctures. I documented the disturbance to my land, the tracks of heavy machinery, the excavated soil carelessly heaped up. I also deployed unobtrusive motion-activated trail cameras overlooking the spring and segments of the pipeline on my property. Should anyone from the HOA or their contractors presume to re-enter my land, I would have them captured candidly. Next, I delved into my archives. I possessed copies of all the original plat maps for my property and the adjacent area, including the land that became Whispering Pines. I cross-referenced everything with the County Appraisal District's online GIS system and subsequently made a trip to the county clerk's office to retrieve the actual recorded plats and any declared easements for the Whispering Pines development. As I had anticipated, there was absolutely nothing granting them access to my land or my water. Their entire development plan, on file with the county, indicated their water supply was intended to originate from a series of deep wells drilled on their own common land or, eventually, connection to the municipal utility district, which was still some miles distant and would be expensive. Brenda, it appeared, had chosen a more economical, albeit entirely unlawful, alternative. Fortified with this initial collection of evidence, I composed a formal cease and desist letter. It was courteous but resolute, citing the specific parcel numbers, the nature of the trespass, the unauthorized appropriation of water resources, and a demand for the immediate cessation of any further work, the removal of the pipeline, and the remediation of my land within 14 days. I enclosed copies of my deed, the pertinent survey map highlighting the property lines and the spring's location squarely within my boundaries, and a few key aerial photographs. I dispatched it via certified mail, return receipt requested, to Brenda McKentitle, President, Whispering Pines HOA, and a copy to the HOA's registered agent. The green return receipt card arrived, signed, a few days later. Then, silence for approximately a week. Nothing. I persisted with my monitoring. The trail cameras revealed no fresh activity. Perhaps, I mused, they were actually addressing it seriously. Perhaps they were consulting a competent lawyer who would elucidate to them the colossal error they had committed. I should have known better. Brenda McKennidold was not the type to acknowledge a mistake, especially not one of this scale. Approximately 10 days after I dispatched the letter, I received a reply. Not from Brenda directly, but from a law firm I had never encountered, Dewey, Cheatham and Howe, or something equally unoriginal. The letter was a paragon of obfuscation and thinly disguised disdain. It was replete with legal-sounding phrases like long-standing community understanding, implied easement by necessity, and public benefit doctrine, all of which were utter balderdash in this situation. They asserted the HOA possessed a good faith conviction that they were operating within their rights to guarantee water security for the residents. They vaguely alluded to discussions with the previous owner of my property, a gentleman who had been deceased for 20 years and from whom I held a direct warranty deed with no such encumbrances mentioned. The letter concluded by affirming that the HOA deemed the matter settled and would strenuously defend its entitlement to sustain the vital community water infrastructure. It was evident Brenda had merely passed my detailed letter to the most inexpensive lawyer she could locate, who then reiterated her talking points into a shoddily composed response. She was intensifying her stance. The audacity was almost admirable, were it not so exasperating. Around this period, I also began to detect the distinct sound of water pumps operating intermittently from the direction of the HOA. I inspected my spring. The flow was undeniably, measurably diminished. They hadn't merely installed the pipe. They were now actively drawing water. My water. This escalation impelled me to contact a few individuals. Firstly, my own legal counsel, Ms. Eleanor Sharp. Ellie was a remarkably astute attorney specializing in property and water law, renowned for her persistence and her aversion to bullies. When I presented the situation and displayed my documentation, her eyes sparkled with a predatory intensity. "Frank," she stated after scrutinizing everything, "this isn't merely trespass. This is grand theft water if such a charge existed. The sheer arrogance is, well, it's going to make this enjoyable." She affirmed my legal standing was unassailable and advised me on the subsequent measures. "Let them continue to operate it for a short while, Frank," she counseled. "Let them become reliant on it. Document their consumption. The damages claim will be that much more substantial. We're not just going to have that pipe removed. We're going to ensure they compensate for every drop, plus your time, my time, and a generous portion for punitive damages." This HOA president sounds like a classic narcissist who believes rules are for others. Ellie's assurance was contagious and strengthened my determination. I also resolved to conduct a bit of discreet reconnaissance within Whispering Pines itself. I had a casual acquaintance there, a fellow retiree named Tom, who was more of a grumbling, reluctant HOA member than a genuine supporter. I met him for coffee in town and subtly broached the subject of HOA projects. Tom complained about escalating dues and Brenda's increasingly autocratic style. When I cautiously mentioned the new water line, Tom's eyebrows ascended. "Yeah, Brenda made a significant announcement about procuring a new independent water source for the community a few weeks ago," he said. "Claimed it would save us a fortune on well maintenance and postpone having to pay the exorbitant hookup fees for city water. She was very self-satisfied about it, claimed all the credit. Most people just accepted it, pleased to hear about savings." He then lowered his voice. "But Martha Henderson, who's resided here since the development first opened, told me she considered it suspicious. Said she recalled Old Man Weatherby, who owned your place before you, being extremely particular about his spring." Martha Henderson. That was a name to retain. Tom provided me with her house number. A few days later, I paid a visit to Martha. She was an energetic woman in her late 70s with a sharp intellect and a no-nonsense demeanor. When I explained who I was and the reason for my visit, she invited me in at once. "I knew it," she declared before I had even completed my account. I told my son, I said, Brenda's gotten too big for her britches if she thinks she can just appropriate water from the Weatherby spring. Old man Weatherby would have retrieved his shotgun. Martha confirmed that there had never been any accord, formal or informal, for the HOA to utilize water from my property. She had served on the initial resident advisory committee when the development was being planned. They drilled 2 wells, she stated emphatically. One went dry rather quickly, and the other one has always been undependable, particularly in summer. Brenda's been desperate for a solution that doesn't involve spending a fortune on the municipal connection or drilling more costly wells. It appears she found one, or so she believed. Martha was a godsend. She was prepared to furnish a sworn affidavit detailing her knowledge of the circumstances. She was also, it transpired, thoroughly weary of Brenda's governance and was quietly in favor of anyone who might humble her. My file of evidence was expanding, and so was my confidence. Brenda McKennittald imagined she was being astute. She was, in reality, meticulously orchestrating her own undoing, and I was more than willing to assist her in laying the groundwork. The water coursing through that illicit pipe wasn't merely H2O. It was a ticking clock, and time was diminishing for her. With Ms. Sharp's strategic counsel resonating in my mind, let them hang themselves with their own rope, Frank, then we give it a good, firm tug. I proceeded to the subsequent phase. Meticulous preparation for the unavoidable shutdown. The objective wasn't solely to reclaim my water, but to achieve this in a manner that was legally beyond reproach and would leave Brenda McKennittald with absolutely no avenue for evasion. Firstly, I persisted in documenting the HOA's water consumption. I installed an unobtrusive flow meter, temporarily and still on my side of the fence naturally, on the segment of pipe near my spring, merely to gain an estimate of the volume they were abstracting. The figures were substantial, particularly during peak daylight hours when landscaping irrigation systems in Whispering Pines were likely operational. Every gallon they appropriated was another notation on the damages ledger Ellie Sharp was mentally assembling. I also maintained detailed logs, recording when I heard their pumps functioning, cross-referencing it with the flow meter data and the discernible drawdown at my spring. My dossier was becoming impressively substantial. Surveys, deeds, county records, aerial and ground photography, video footage, copies of all correspondence, Martha Henderson's sworn affidavit, and now water usage logs. It was a bulwark of facts. The crucial component of my plan involved installing a master shutoff valve on the pipeline. This needed to be executed on my property, upstream from where the pipe traversed the boundary fence. And it had to appear entirely as a legitimate enhancement to my own water management system. I wasn't merely going to constrict the pipe. I was going to install a heavy-duty, industrial-grade ball valve, complete with a lockable handle. I contacted an old acquaintance, Jerry, a licensed master plumber I'd known for 30 years, a man whose discretion was as renowned as his proficiency with a wrench. I elucidated the situation. Jerry, a fellow enthusiast of property rights, found the entire affair both shocking and grimly humorous. He consented to perform the installation, officially permitted as an agricultural irrigation system upgrade on my property. We arranged the work for a weekday morning when most Whispering Pines residents would be at their jobs or otherwise engaged. Jerry arrived with his vehicle. We erected a temporary men working sign near my access gate, far from the HOA's intrusive gaze, and he commenced. The installation was impeccable. The new valve was positioned in a neatly excavated, gravel-lined pit, readily accessible but not immediately discernible to a casual observer from a distance. It appeared, for all intents and purposes, like a professional, permanent fixture designed for managing my own water. Once Jerry had finished and departed, I affixed a heavy-duty padlock to the valve handle, ensuring it was firmly in the off position. The illicit tap was now officially sealed. The subsequent step was selecting the opportune moment to actually, definitively cut off their unauthorized supply. Ms. Sharp had recommended waiting for a period when they would be most dependent on it, to maximize the impact and underscore their reliance. The local weather forecast furnished the ideal signal. A late-season heat wave was anticipated for the ensuing week, with temperatures expected to climb into the high 90s. Excellent. Lawns would be parched, pools would require refilling, and Brenda's independent water source would be more vital than ever. I waited until the second day of the heat wave. I could discern the distant, almost ceaseless hum of their pumps. They were consuming my spring water at a remarkable pace. Mid-morning, when the sun was already intensely hot, I took a quiet amble out to my new valve installation. With a profound sense of grim contentment and a silent apology to the spring itself for the mistreatment it had undergone, I rotated the lever a full 90 degrees. The flow through the pipe ceased with a barely perceptible exhalation. Then silence. A beautiful, gratifying silence. Back at my residence, I settled onto my porch with a tall glass of iced tea, made with my own, unadulterated spring water, and waited. It did not take much time. Perhaps 2 hours later, I heard the initial faint sounds of dismay wafting over from Whispering Pines. A lawnmower sputtered and died, refusing to restart. Then a raised voice carried on the hot, still air someone clearly displeased. I envisioned the scene, sprinklers ceasing mid-arc, showers diminishing to a mere trickle, toilets declining to refill. The meticulously maintained green lawns of Whispering Pines were about to become extremely parched. My trail cam overlooking the fence line captured a figure, likely an HOA contracted landscaper or handyman, peering towards my property with a perplexed expression. A short while later, he made a call on his mobile phone. I could almost discern Brenda McKentitle's shriek of indignation from my location. She would, true to her nature, presume a simple mechanical malfunction. She would dispatch someone to rectify it. They would trace the line back, find it devoid of water, and eventually they would discover my new, very official-looking valve. They would report that the water was off at the source on my property. And that, I was aware, was when Brenda's notorious temper, combined with her staggering sense of entitlement, would compel her to make her most significant misstep yet. She wouldn't contact me. She wouldn't contact her lawyer, who probably would have advised restraint, even that dim individual. No, Brenda would perceive this as sabotage and assault on her authority and her precious community. She would summon the authorities, portraying herself as the aggrieved party and me as the transgressor. And that was precisely what I was anticipating. The snare was laid. All that remained was for the prey to step into it. The late afternoon sun was starting to descend towards the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple when the distant but unmistakable sound of sirens reached my ears. One, then two. They were drawing nearer. I took a deliberate sip of my tea. Showtime. I remained on my porch, tranquil and composed, my meticulously arranged binder of evidence resting on the small table beside my rocking chair. True to form, 2 county sheriff's department SUVs, lights still flashing, halted at the main gate of Whispering Pines. I observed through my binoculars as Brenda McKentitle, appearing flustered and irate in a vivid pink tracksuit that did her no credit in the oppressive heat, practically sprang out to meet them. She was animated, gesticulating extravagantly, pointing dramatically in the direction of my ranch. I could only surmise the barrage of accusations she was directing at me: destruction of HOA property, denial of essential services, malicious mischief, probably even eco-terrorism, given her penchant for drama. She was embodying the role of the wronged community leader to the fullest. After several minutes of this display, one of the SUVs, transporting 2 deputies, disengaged from the group and proceeded slowly down the road towards my property entrance. They parked just beyond my gate. 2 deputies alighted, a senior, seasoned officer with a no-nonsense demeanor, Sergeant Miller, and a younger, more observant-looking deputy, Deputy Rodriguez. They approached my porch with caution but professionally. I rose to greet them. "Good afternoon, officers," I stated, my voice steady and calm. "May I assist you with something?" Sergeant Miller addressed the matter directly. "Sir, we've received a complaint from the HOA president over at Whispering Pines, a Miss Brenda McKentitle. She alleges that you've intentionally shut off their water supply and are damaging their infrastructure." I nodded slowly. "Ah, yes, Miss McKentitle. I imagine she's quite distressed. There appears to be a significant misunderstanding on her part, officers. Perhaps you'd care to step onto the porch out of the sun? I believe I can elucidate the situation for you." I gestured to the chairs. They exchanged a brief glance, then assented. This was already a deviation from the belligerent old recluse they might have anticipated based on Brenda's diatribe. Once they were seated, I commenced. "Officers, to be unequivocally clear, the pipeline and the water source in question are entirely on my private property. Serenity Springs Ranch. Ms. McKendild and the Whispering Pines HOA installed that pipeline across my land and tapped into my private spring without my knowledge, without my permission, and without any legal right or easement whatsoever. I then reached for my binder. I understand this might resemble a simple property dispute, but I assure you the documentation is quite unambiguous. I opened the binder to the first page, a large, color-coded survey plat of my ranch with the spring and the illegal pipeline clearly marked well within my boundaries. I then presented them with my warranty deed, the county tax maps, and my official state water rights certificate for the spring. As you can observe, I explained, I am the sole proprietor of this land and this water source. The HOA has, in effect, been trespassing and unlawfully appropriating my water. I then furnished copies of the cease and desist letter I had dispatched, the dismissive reply from the HOA's attorney, and even Martha Henderson's affidavit. I showed them photographs of the pipeline construction on my land. Finally, I clarified, this morning I simply shut off an unauthorized connection to my private water system on my own property utilizing a legally installed valve. I possess every right to control access to my own resources, especially when they are being taken illicitly. I offered them Ms. Sharp's business card. My attorney, Ms. Eleanor Sharp, is fully apprised of this situation and can corroborate all these facts. The deputies listened intently, their expressions transitioning from neutral skepticism to thoughtful consideration as they scrutinized the documents. Deputy Rodriguez, in particular, seemed to be absorbing every detail, his eyes scanning the plats and legal papers. Sergeant Miller, a man who had likely encountered his share of peculiar neighbor disputes, posed a few pertinent questions. Did you attempt to resolve this with them prior to shutting it off? Yes, sir. As demonstrated by the certified letter and their lawyer's response, which rejected my claims. Are you cognizant of the impact this has on the residents over there? I am sympathetic to the residents, officer, but they are being deceived by their HOA president. The responsibility for furnishing them with a legal water source rests with the HOA, not with me through the theft of my private resources. My responses were factual, dispassionate, and substantiated by the paperwork before them, a stark contrast, I imagined, to Brenda's earlier emotional outbursts. After approximately 20 minutes, Sergeant Miller nodded. All right, Mr. Henderson, I had introduced myself properly. Thank you for your cooperation. We need to go speak with Ms. McKendild again. They returned my binder and proceeded back to their vehicle. I watched them drive back towards the Whispering Pines entrance, where Brenda was undoubtedly pacing with impatience. The wait this time was more prolonged. I could observe the two deputies conversing with Brenda again. Even from a distance, her body language conveyed outrage. Her arms were flailing, she was pointing, her head shaking vehemently. The deputies, however, appeared much less receptive on this occasion. Eventually, the second SUV, which had remained with Brenda, drew up alongside the first. There was further discussion. I saw Sergeant Miller make a call on his radio. This was it, the pivotal moment. About 10 more minutes elapsed. Then the incredible occurred. I saw Deputy Rodriguez approach Brenda, who seemed to be in the midst of a tirade. The deputy spoke to her, and suddenly Brenda became very still. Then she erupted. I couldn't discern the words, but the fury was palpable. Sergeant Miller stepped forward, and then, clear as day, I saw Deputy Rodriguez produce a pair of handcuffs. Brenda McKendild's jaw dropped. She began to struggle, shouting, pointing at the deputies, then at my ranch, then back at herself as if to convey, "Me? You're arresting me." The deputies were firm but professional. Despite her protests and a last-minute attempt to play the "Do you know who I am" card, which I could almost lip-read, they cuffed her. Her expensive pink tracksuit suddenly appeared very incongruous as she was guided, protesting loudly, towards the back of one of the patrol cars. The other HOA board members who had congregated looked on in stunned silence, their faces a blend of disbelief and dawning horror. The door slammed shut on Brenda McKendild, HOA president, now a ward of the county. The deputies then spent some time conversing with the remaining, visibly unsettled board members before finally departing, one SUV taking Brenda with them. I permitted myself a small, gratified smile. The trap hadn't merely been sprung, it had snapped shut with a beautiful, resounding clang of justice. She had summoned the police on me for cutting off the water she was pilfering. And ultimately, they arrested her. The irony was exquisite. The aftermath of Brenda McKendild's very public arrest was, to state it mildly, extraordinary. Information travels rapidly in a small community. and intelligence concerning an HOA president being taken away in handcuffs for purportedly orchestrating the theft of water from a neighboring ranch and subsequently filing a false police report about it. That category of story possesses endurance, impetus, and a significant boost. By the following morning, it was the primary topic of conversation in town and certainly the sole subject of discussion in Whispering Pines. My telephone began ringing early, predominantly local numbers I didn't recognize, but I allowed my answering machine to screen them. Ms. Sharp, however, received an immediate response. "Frank," she said, her voice filled with amusement, "I've just had a rather agitated call from a Mr. Abernathy who asserts he is the vice president of the Whispering Pines HOA. He sounded as if he were on the verge of a seizure. Apparently, Sergeant Miller suggested they contact you, or rather your lawyer, to discuss remediation and potential civil liabilities before the county attorney becomes any more intrigued by the HOA's corporate culpability." She chuckled. "I believe the deputies elucidated the situation quite distinctly for Ms. McKentittled after they reviewed your evidence. Theft of utility services is a grave charge, especially on this scale, and filing a false police report is merely the embellishment for the prosecutor. Brenda apparently insisted you were the perpetrator. That didn't sit well when they possessed your deeds and surveys. Brenda, as it transpired, endured a rather discomforting night in the county jail before her flustered husband managed to secure bail. The charges remained: felony theft of service, given the volume of water and duration, and making a false report to law enforcement. Her hastily retained, expensive lawyer was facing a difficult contest against the mountain of evidence I had furnished and the clear, succinct report from Sergeant Miller and Deputy Rodriguez, who had been thoroughly impressed by my organized presentation and equally unimpressed by Brenda's histrionics and absence of any documentation. The HOA itself was plunged into utter disarray, with their president confronting criminal charges and their independent water source now definitively and permanently unavailable. They were, to employ a technical phrase, in a dire predicament without a solution, or in this instance, water. The remaining board members, a group of Brenda's facilitators, and a few well-intentioned but uninformed individuals were in a state of panic. They confronted not only the immediate water crisis but also the indignation of the residents, who were incensed about being deceived and now facing the prospect of immense costs to procure a legal water supply, not to mention the ignominy of their community being embroiled in such a scandal. Ms. Sharp, true to her commitment, initiated a vigorous civil action against the Whispering Pines HOA on my behalf. The claims encompass trespass, damage to property, the unlawful trenching and installation, conversion, the unauthorized taking of my water, and a demand for full remediation of my land, meaning the complete removal of their pipeline at their expense, plus significant monetary damages and all legal costs. The HOA's budget lawyer was promptly superseded by a more proficient and undoubtedly more costly legal team who, after examining our claim and the associated evidence, swiftly acknowledged they faced an unwinnable case. Negotiations commenced. They initially still attempted to swagger their way into some form of continued access, perhaps a fair usage agreement. Sharp terminated that notion immediately. My client was extended no such consideration when your client was pilfering his water, she informed them icily. The commencement point for any discussion is the complete dismantlement of all unauthorized infrastructure from his property and full indemnification. The resolution required a few months of legal contention, but the outcome was never truly uncertain. The HOA, under enormous pressure from its residents and confronting the stark reality of its legal jeopardy, conceded. They consented to pay for a specialized crew, approved by me, to professionally remove every inch of the pipeline from my land and restore the terrain to its original state. They also paid a substantial six-figure settlement covering the estimated value of the water appropriated, damages to my property, my considerable time and effort in documenting the theft, and all of Ms. Sharp's legal fees, with a pleasant additional sum for punitive damages, just as Ellie had foreseen. Brenda McKentittled eventually pleaded no contest to a lesser misdemeanor charge for the false police report, contingent upon making a public apology, which, I am informed, was a masterclass in grudging, through clenched teeth insincerity, and paying a substantial fine plus mandated community service. Ironically, she was assigned to a local conservation group, likely counting tree rings or something equally galling for her. The theft of service charge was held in abeyance pending successful completion of her probation and full restitution to the HOA for costs associated with her illegal scheme, which I heard was a significant sum they intended to recover from her personally. Her tenure as HOA president was, of course, terminated. She resigned in disgrace shortly after her arrest, and I heard she and her husband listed their Whispering Pines house for sale not long thereafter. As for Whispering Pines, they had to confront the inevitable and pay the exorbitant fees to connect to the municipal water utility, a project that consumed the better part of a year and entailed considerable expense and disruption for the residents. A new, much more unassuming and diligent HOA board was elected, their principal mandate being, no more scandals and secure us some legal water. My acquaintance, Martha Henderson, even joined the new board, contributing a much-needed measure of common sense. Occasionally, the new HOA leadership would encounter me in town, and they would offer a polite, almost deferential nod. No one from Whispering Pines ever inquired about my spring water again. My ranch, Serenity Springs, reverted to its tranquil condition. The spring flowed unhindered, my stock ponds were full, and the only lines on my land were those that rightfully belonged there. Reflecting on it, it was an absurd quantity of turmoil over something that ought to have been straightforward. But it served as a potent reminder that property rights are only as robust as one's resolve to protect them. Brenda McKentitle misjudged me. She perceived an elderly man on a quiet ranch, not an individual with the skills, the patience, and the sheer unyielding determination to see justice prevail. She learned, through harsh experience, that one cannot simply take what is not theirs, especially when it belongs to someone who knows precisely where the boundary is established.